Welcome to the Long Take Review, a film podcast with one eye always on the Oscar race. I'm your host, Jen Substack, and I'm here with a couple of other podcasters. Why did it have to be podcasters? First, it's the friend who would surely save me from bad dates, PT McNiff. How's it going, PT?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, until I get back my $5,000, you're going to get more than you bargained for. I'm your goddamn partner. It's good, Jen. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. And you'd never catch him hiding in a fridge. It's Greg Cass. How are you doing, Greg?
Very good. Fresh from not outer space, but the space between spaces.
Oh, no. So these quips might give you a clue as to what we're talking about today, Indiana Jones. And more specifically, we're doing a whole episode to help you get excited for, or perhaps just mentally prepared for, kind of depending on where you're at, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, which we're all seeing sometime this weekend. Greg and I are seeing it on Thursday, which by the time this posts will be tonight probably, and PT is going to see it on Saturday. And after that, after we've all seen Dial of Destiny, we're going to record another episode to review just that film. But today's all about looking back at past films and just generally appreciating Indiana Jones. We're showing our love for everyone's favorite archaeologist. So let's start with everyone's prior relationship to Indiana Jones. And since Greg is wearing a fedora, he gets to start.
All right. So the standard line I've been using with friends, family, passersby on the street, students, dogs I talk to, is that actually people know me as the world's biggest Star Wars fan that they know, but I actually loved Indiana Jones long before I loved Star Wars, because Indiana Jones was in my house and Star Wars was not growing up. We were just comparing notes. I'm a child of the Star Wars dark time. So I was born in 1983 and my family just wasn't a sci-fi family, but they were an Indiana Jones family. And so we had the VHS tapes the whole time I was growing up, and I was like welcome to grab them and watch them after a certain point. So I fell in love with Indiana Jones. I would say like by the time I was in like 5th, 6th grade, I'd seen the original 3 and really, really loved them. And it always felt across, my kind of adolescence as Star Wars came back, it was like there was always the hope that Indy would come back, but it really was like slim pickings. A couple great memories I have on a field trip to Boston. There was a bookstore in Faneuil Hall that was the Doubleday publisher. And that was the first time in my life I saw the Indiana Jones books. And it was like a dream. Like I walked in, there were like 10 books. I'm like, there are Indiana Jones books? And I bought like 2 or 3, like whatever my, probably lunch money for the field trip could handle. And then it was like, I had found a special secret and nobody else could find them. Nobody else could order them for me. And this is a long time ago, so there was no internet booksellers or anything like that. My other favorite memory involves Jen, which is we were in grad school when Crystal Skull came out, and we went the day all the merch dropped. And I believe there were peanut M&Ms that had Indiana Jones on the bag, and there was definitely Dr. Pepper that had Indiana Jones. And we went and scooped up a bunch of this stuff, plus I'm sure books, posters, action figures, all the usual crap. And we went to lunch, and as we sat there at the table, the waiter or waitress came up and was like, "So you guys are like promotional? You're out on the streets giving out these Indiana Jones stuff?" And we're like,
yes.
"No, we just really love Indiana Jones and have." And then I do remember they made us put away the Dr. Pepper. They're like, "Well, no outside beverages. Get it out of here." So those are my bona fides. Long time Indiana Jones fan.
So maybe you'll remember this. Sorry, you'll get to go in a second, PT. But I found when I was cleaning out a bunch of my bookshelf, I found this diary from Crystal Skull. So, but I do not remember where I got it from. So I bet
that was that day, because we would have been right near the Barnes and Noble near the Prudential Center. So
because I was like, did I get this in Disney World? Like, what is? Because it's like a diary written from the point of view of the KGB. It's very odd. It's like.
Yeah.
But thank you.
That sounds awesome. That does sound like that would make sense that like the late 2000s was also when the I think I have the like Jedi Order text, and they had like a Sith text that was obviously Star Wars stuff. But like they would publish the books, and then it was like annotated from different characters. So it was like, these are Yoda's notes, and this is Luke's notes, and Qui-Gon wrote this. And so I could see that maybe being like they did an Indiana Jones version of it. I feel like Indiana Jones merch is always like, what if we did the Star Wars thing, but with Indiana Jones?
Yeah,
And it like,
indie.
and it generally doesn't, sell, but
Yeah.
but yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, so there's like redactive memos
That's cool.
in here, and but it's supposed to be the diary of like it's the notebook, right? Indy's notebook, but that's been confiscated by the KGB. I think is the premise of this book. It's very weird. Anyway, but PT, what is your relationship prior to this to Indiana Jones?
So, I mean, I'm not trying to like win any contests or trump anyone in this conversation. But the thing that I say to people, and this is accurate, is watching Raiders of the Lost Ark is the first thing I remember in my life. Like the earliest memory I have is sitting on my couch in my parents' living room, and a babysitter who lived across the street, who was babysitting me, was super pumped because my grandparents had gotten my parents a VCR, which was like it felt super new. And they were able to rent what was then like a brand newly released on video movie. And the moment in Raiders of the Lost Ark, when he gets the truck chase, when he gets thrown out of the truck and he's hanging onto the hood ornament and it just slowly bends down and then snaps, like sitting in the couch, watching that in that context with the like still very like 70s decor that was my parents' living room is the first thing I remember. I can't remember anything before that. So basically it's been with me as far as I know in my brain. So yeah, I mean, I don't remember seeing, because I was still like, that's a flash of a memory. I don't think I would have been old enough to go see Temple of Doom in the theater. But I definitely remember I was about 10 when Last Crusade came out, and it was like marketed as like, and James Bond is Indiana Jones's dad. And so like my dad was like, made sure like we went and saw it together. I think we saw it like a couple times. And that's that's a good happy memory. Yeah, I mean, it was just like pretty constant. I think it's been discussed before. I came from like a movie family, and we're rewatchers of movies. So, it would be a thing that would get thrown on as like everyone's happy, like and no one's like going to be sad if one of the Indiana Jones movies gets put on. And to go more recently, my first trip back to movie theaters after like the pandemic, or the pandemic, not like the pandemic, but the actual pandemic, was after the first sort of double dose of the vaccine, when it was like, I guess we could go and do things again. Was all three of the original Indiana Jones movies in one day at the $1 Million Theater in downtown Los Angeles, which has incredibly uncomfortable seats. So I don't necessarily recommend sitting there for, almost 7 hours. But maybe they're not uncomfortable. They just are. Any seat is uncomfortable if you sit in them for 7 hours. But just magical to watch them all. Like they all play like gangbusters in a crowd, especially a crowd full of people who were just excited to be able to go feel like you could safely go back to the movies. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I love Indiana Jones.
If I'm thinking about early Indiana Jones memories, they're actually traumatic because, and I don't remember, like, I'm not as precise with my memory and age as it sounds like you are. So I don't know how old I was when I had from what that this memory came from, but I have a distinct memory sneaking behind the couch in our living room while all the grown-ups in my family were watching Temple of Doom. And so there was Temple of Doom and then True Lies. Those were the two movies that like scarred me as a child.
Sure.
They were really, my family was just really bad somehow. In retrospect, I don't know why. Maybe they just didn't. I don't know if they didn't care, because if they saw me looking, they'd be like, "Get out of here!" Right? But they just were like not very. They were pretty oblivious. It was pretty easy for me to like watch adult movies when I was a child on the DL. But I remember the heart grabbing scene in Temple of Doom. Like that was in my nightmares all throughout my childhood. Like that was just like something about that was so terrifying that it really stuck with me. So like I don't know, but then my happy memories are, we used to go every couple of years to Disney World as our like big family vacation for the year, and the Indiana Jones Stunt Spectacular is one of my absolute favorite things.
Oh yeah.
And I just remember like it's something I would look forward to every year, and it never got old. Like I've probably seen it dozens of times. And it's never gotten old. So those are kind of my early memories I think about.
And Greg recently was share. I forget, this was like an Instagram post or a text message share. I didn't know, because I've moved to the West Coast and have the Disneyland thing. I didn't know it was still happened. I was just like, oh, they must have gotten rid of. I assume they would get rid of that at some point, but they still have it, and that made me so nostalgic for seeing it. I didn't go every year, but I remember going like a handful of times when I was a kid, and like so incredibly jealous of Greg, because he's just like, I'm here at the like, and having a photo. It's like, oh man, that's awesome.
I think it was like he booked his Dial of Destiny tickets while sitting in the audience.
Yes,
waiting for the Stunt Spectacular, right?
The way Disney World works right now is you have to tell them in advance which park you're going to start the day at. And I had just picked Monday to be our Hollywood Studios day. And I saw sometime over the weekend that like that was going to be Dial of Destiny tickets, but I didn't think about it again because I was trying to take my kid to Disney World and experience Batuu and all these great things. And then, we sat down for the 3:30 Stunt Spectacular, and I was like, oh, I forgot to order Dial of Destiny tickets. And I'm a little, they're still kind of available. I'm not sure how this is going to do, but, I had a great seat, and it was like perfect. And I definitely bragged to everybody I know. I'm like, I'm sitting essentially in the temple ordering my Dial of Destiny tickets. But I will say my one complaint about I have probably been to the Stunt Spectacular maybe 8 or 9 times in my life. I think I've only seen the whole thing complete once. There's always some part of it not working, and I don't know if this is a common experience. This particular time, that time we were sitting there, they did the temple portion, and then they're like, and it's thundering, so we can't open it up and do the marketplace. So we were like, oh, we waited 20 minutes for a 10-minute show. So it was still a little disappointing, but it is such a great experience. I think the key in Florida humidity is go to the midday showings if people are listening and want to do it, because by the afternoon there's often enough of a thunderstorm threat that they don't want to do the big parts.
If we're also doing like deep tangential Indiana Jones cuts, the LucasArts game.
Oh my god, yes.
Indiana Jones, the Atlantis one.
The Fate of Atlantis.
Thank you. I've played that so many times. Apparently not as many times as PT, because I didn't remember the exact title. But
well, the weird thing for me is I actually spent way more time playing the Last Crusade adaptation, which doesn't really change anything, but makes it a point and click adventure. And it was like sort of the LucasArts Maniac Mansion style way of interacting with the world, which was awesome. And then, I just played that so much that when Fate of Atlantis came out, I was like, this is so exciting. And then I don't know what happened. I remember never finishing that game because I had done Last Crusade like 20 times just playing through that game. But the story was great. Like I remember reading the Fate of Atlantis story.
And they kept trying, and it's shocking to me we don't have 20 Indiana Jones video games, because it seems like a no-brainer, but they've never quite cracked it. They did Infernal Machine and Staff of Kings, and they did the little it's like Yoda Stories, but as a desktop adventures. That was a great LucasArts title. And then I think 2 different Lego games, which are on brand for Lego. So yeah,
I think part of the challenge might be that to make a really good Indiana Jones game, I feel like the puzzle part of it has to be really good, and that's just harder than like more of just an action platformer kind of situation. So, which this might be a good segue into what we wanted to talk about next, which is what do you love about Indiana Jones? Like, what are the key characteristics? And I both mean that in terms of as a character, what do you love about the character? What do you love about the film franchise? And just kind of like, what are the defining features that you associate with it?
Well, I mean, I would say maybe this is starting almost too obvious and basic, but it's a sort of globe-trotting adventure with an eye towards some sort of the MacGuffin, the sort of thing that he's always after, is based in some sort of historical religious iconography, and because it's sort of set in or at least the beginning of the character is in the 30s. That there's obviously at least multiple times where it's like, and he's fighting the Nazis because that's stuff that like Nazis were also doing. So that sort of the brewing, the buildup of World War II is a part of it. There's negative elements to that too, which maybe we will save because that's not what I love about it. The colonialism of it all. But yeah, so it's that the throwback to that kind of old serial, that like Lucas mindset of just sort of like, yeah, what if it's just sort of like every like 15 minutes is like its own little story and there's another big action scene that happens there. And the other thing I will just add is it's the character is just someone who gets the crap beat out of him all the time, which isn't unique for for Indiana Jones, but I think that's so important that like this isn't like The Rock and Jason Statham being like, well, neither of us can ever lose a fight, so how are we going to figure out to be in a movie together where we're constantly fighting, because we'll never our persona is we can never lose. Harrison Ford is just like, I lose all the time, and I'm constantly losing, and no one is better at like really leaning into taking a punch and looking bewildered by it than Harrison Ford.
I was gonna say looking fabulous.
Yeah, oh, totally.
Also.
I mean, look, yeah, and also like, does anyone in the history of humanity look better than Harrison Ford in a leather jacket and a fedora? Maybe Harrison Ford in a suit lecturing a class in glasses, but those are really the only two options.
That's probably one of the things I love most. I mean, like, the three of us, I think it's no coincidence that the three of us are professors and we really like this character. I don't know how narcissistic that is, but the idea that he's somehow this great adventurer, very capable in the field, but then also really knowledgeable and scholarly and knows his stuff. Like, I think the character of Indiana Jones doesn't work if he doesn't have that second part, right? I think that's a fundamental, the fact that he can find the things, find where to dig when no one else is digging in the right place, because he can figure out the riddles or figure out the clues, is I think really essential. Otherwise he might just be kind of like a run of the mill action hero, right? But the fact that he's kind of has these two sides to him, I think is really cool. What about you, Greg?
Yeah, I was going to agree with that and say part of how I read that today is like, I don't think anybody else could play this role, right? And I think look at all the failed imitators of the last, 30 years and see that nobody quite can balance that the way Harrison Ford can balance those two sides. Like, you believe him throwing a punch on Pat Roach or some other stuntman under an airplane or on a minecart or what have you, and you believe him in the classroom. And the only one who gives me a moment's pause is like maybe Chris Pine is getting there as he's kind of aged up a little bit, like, and he's got his kind of I shop at bookstores internet persona. It's like, oh, maybe he's gonna be the one who could do that. But yeah, I absolutely have always thought, this is probably my favorite fictional character of all time. There's just a richness and a depth to him. And, part of it is that he always feels like he cares so much about the objects and the history and putting it in a museum, but he doesn't actually want to be out doing this. It's kind of like he's like, I have to be the one, right? And actually, my brother-in-law pointed out to me one time that what he always loves in every Indiana Jones movie is there's always a moment where Indy proves he's the smartest. And that's his superpower, right? He can figure out the puzzle. He can take the clue. He can piece this together in a way that nobody else can. And we'll talk about each of these movies, I'm sure, in great detail, but that to me screams the map room, right? Like, he figured it out. He got both sides of the medallion. And, you hear the music just thinking about it. And it's so wonderful that that's the brand of hero that Lucas and Spielberg brought into this, right? And I think it says everything that when, you know, this tale about how Spielberg wanted to do James Bond and Lucas says, I have something better. The better that they both seem to agree on is like, yeah, but what if it's like nerdy James Bond? And that totally fits with what we know about the two of them, and opens up this great realm of possibility. And you know, I love every time he pops up. I love, you know, the video games, the books, all these things. There's been many attempts at comics and they don't stick, but should, because it all seems to fit. But you know, I think there's such a rich set of stories available to you when you draw into mythology, into the supernatural, just a little, right? It's always just a dip in to give you a little taste of it. And so that just, especially to, you know, a young kid, in my watch through of these movies, my son joined me for the first time and loved them. He would put Crystal Skull #1 on his list, which is why he's safely in bed and not here on the podcast.
I thought you were gonna say that's why he's at an orphanage. He's been baby safe haven at a nearby firehouse.
And it's just like there's something timeless about it, and that all came from sitting in the Stunt Spectacular, being like, "Wait, Dad, who is this? Like, is this something that isn't just a dad thing?" And you know, I think we're all about to find out whether it's just a dad thing or dads dragging their kids. No offense to the female fans, of course, but is it going to be a middle-aged people thing, or are people going to come back? I think is a real coin toss at this particular moment as we sit on the precipice. But I will always love this character. And, you know, as much as I love Star Wars, most Saturday afternoons, if I'm in the house by myself, I don't probably rather throw on one of the indie movies. And as PT said, you can kind of just jump on for 20 minutes anywhere and not be disappointed. And back when television existed, that's what we all used to do endlessly. They were always on cable and TBS and all those places.
When I was trying to do my recent rewatch, sometimes I would have to go do something else. And so I was like, well, it's better if I listen to the movie or part of the movie instead of not finishing the rewatch, right? That's like that was my logic. I wouldn't have preferred to do it that way, but I think just life got in the way. But what I realized was there were huge stretches where there's no talking in so many of these movies. And, you know, when I would sit back down and kind of tune back in, I would realize that there's something really special about how action is a visual language in these films, and how like the action itself has kind of a personality and a sense of humor and a point of view. And there's like even something as simple as like Indy reaching to grab his hat right as the thing's closing or something. Like, you know, like there are little touches like that don't need to be there, but that make all the difference in terms of like how engaging it is. And yeah, just like like a visual sense of humor. I feel like especially on this rewatch, I noticed that the most, where I was like, oh, the idea that he's standing there being like, thanks. I'm not going to remember the villain's name at the beginning of Temple of Doom. The guy's name on the plane. He's like, thanks, so and so. Thank you. Thank you. I knew it was going to get jumped for that. But he's like, you know, better luck next time, or like nice try, right? And then like the guy's name is on the plane right behind him. Like, so like there's like it has such a great sense of humor and wit to it, even at the visual level.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of credit to Spielberg, especially in those original 80s movies, for how, you know, how much he was going for it, and how it showed how like it's easy to write him off, or I see people writing him off as like, he just kind of knows how to like tap into your emotions. He, you know, it's very pandering, pablum, blah, blah, blah. But it's just like he's so technically proficient at like letting you always know where everything is and how movement is flowing within a scene. And in these action scenes he does, you're never confused about what's going on. There's, you know, there's planes, there's boats, there's trucks and cars. and people and horses and all this moving around, and you're always just like, yeah, I know where everybody is. Like, I know the full geography of it. I can follow what's happening, and we can dip in and out. There can be a bunch of really like quick cuts in an action scene. There can be these like subtle oneers that go on for like, minute and a half, 2 minutes, following the characters, following what they're doing. And it's really, really strong work. And it's whatever. Like, is Steven Spielberg underrated? No, but it's worthy of noting it. And to go to another one of the sort of big three creatives historically of it, I think that what Greg was saying earlier, of like, oh, there's been attempts at comics, but like haven't really picked up. There've been books, but the books have never been like like taken off the way that like Star Trek, Star Wars books have, which maybe is adventure versus sci-fi perhaps, but I do think there's something about it being Harrison Ford, because I did throw it in the Google Doc after we started, like somewhere later on, of like, are we going to talk about the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles? Like, are we going to like discuss it? I don't know if we have to, because I watched a bunch of them because I was like, I love Indiana Jones, and like they never really stuck. And I feel like part of it is just that there is something about it being Harrison Ford. And when there was talk at one point, I mean, obviously in Crystal Skull, there was like kind of a like pseudo backdoor attempt of like, what if it was a Mutt Williams story now, and we just followed new star Shia LaBeouf, or it'll be Chris Pratt, or it'll be Bradley Cooper who will take over in the role. And it's sort of like, no, like we don't want that. Like, that's not going to work. Like, it's so tied to Harrison Ford that like almost no other attempts to carry the character forward work, because he's not there, except maybe those old video games where you didn't expect to hear a voice or see more beyond some pixels in a LucasArts game, or like the Temple of Doom arcade game, in which I lost a lot of quarters and never got more than like maybe like 50 seconds into. But yeah, so I think that it's difficult to understate how important both of them are, and obviously Lucas as well, for being the story engine behind it all.
So this is the second time this has come up now, the Harrison Ford factor. Let's get more specific. Like, what do both of you think is the secret sauce of the Harrison Ford performance for this character? Like, why is it that he's the only one that seems to be able to play it?
He's a total dreamboat, number one. And
I'm glad I'm not the one saying that.
Yeah.
Handsome man.
Well, and clearly I'm a gay man from the 50s, or maybe just a woman from the 50s, that I'm going with dreamboat, not something more modern. But I think it is really hard to pinpoint what it is. It seems to me to be a whole lot of charisma. I mean, whoever he's engaged with in these movies, you feel that relationship fully, right? Like, Marion when it's complicated, and Marion when it's not complicated anymore. Marcus, and even in Raiders, where you get just a little Marcus, it's like, oh, they've been friends forever and they're taking care of each other. And I think some of that, comes through in Crystal Skull, where they, for various production reasons, have to slot in a bunch of new people, right? Denham Elliott had passed, so you're like, here's Jim Broadbent, and it's like, totally believe that they are old friends, even though like I've never heard of this character before, and he is clearly just here because Sean Connery said, "No, I'm retired." So I think it has to be part of his magic, is that he can do that. I also I think, and this is like so not true, but he is the kind of movie star that is like attainable good looks. And I would compare him to everybody. Think about Kumail getting so ripped for Eternals for no reason, right? But like all of the Marvel heroes, that's what their bodies look like. And Harrison Ford is in insanely good shape, and a shape I will never see in my life. And yet I look at him and I'm like, I could get there. And, I think this is, I was just listening to a podcast, really tricky, stumbling on why Jennifer Lawrence is not Margot Robbie, to basically be like, she's like a girl you could actually date, not a manufactured in a factory prototype, ideal human. And I feel like that's kind of how Harrison Ford kind of feels to me. He just has enough of an everyman quality that if it's the most cliche thing in the world, right? Women want him and men want to be him. But it's like, I could be him. I can't be Captain America. I could be Indiana Jones if I worked a little harder. And I will not.
Greg, I think ultimately you're right, even though isolated on its own, well, Harrison Ford is just not that attractive. Like, he's attainably attractive. He's you could get him, you could bag him. Is an insane statement, but yeah, I do think there's something like that feels real about him in a way that like superhero people don't. Like, he seems like he's good at portraying someone who like has to go and grade papers or like goes to the grocery store and buys things to come home. Like, you can see a life outside of what happens even in his crazy adventures, which I think is sort of that everyman quality, or at least that sort of like, it just feels like a lived in person quality. I also feel like I just thought of this while we were talking about it, so I don't know if this is a thought I could fully support and back up. That there's sort of like an underlying frustration with Indiana Jones, like almost all the time, that like something isn't going right, and like he should have figured this out, or like he could have solved it. And maybe that's because the last thing I watched was the first half of Raiders of the Lost Ark. But when Brody comes in and he's finished the class and he's like, I had it in my hands. Like, I just need like a little bit more time. And it's always this kind of just like, look, we could do this. We could figure this out. Like, I can, something went wrong. Like, I can fix it. I can solve it. I can do this. And the pretty famous line of what he's sort of like, okay, like, you go get this. I'm going to follow the truck. Da, da, da. He's like, what are you going to do? And he goes, I don't know. I'm making it up as I go along. It feels like that's true. Like, it feels like he's someone who is just like, has a drive for, to do the thing that, whatever the thing is that he's trying to do, which is, generally at least presented in the movie as noble, of like, I want to go find these artifacts and obtain them and keep them safe. That like, that's a good thing. Or I want to like save someone, protect them if they're in danger. That he wants to do that. He's driven to do that. He's frustrated he hasn't already done it. And I think that like that's all kind of roiling in there in a way that, I don't know, somehow Harrison Ford's really good at that. And there's like the banter, there's that rapport, the charm that Greg was talking about with all the other people. But I think that like he has like, he really just understands the spark. I think there's a reason that Han Solo was always just sort of like sort of a mask he put on, whereas he would like, Harrison Ford has always been like, this is a character I love, and I love Indiana Jones. And I think it just makes sense to him.
First of all, I reject all of these like backhanded compliments that Greg's giving to Harrison Ford.
I reject that Greg like could attain Harrison Ford-like qualities. I hear you.
You just need one chin scar and you're good to go.
Yeah.
No, because like, as I was rewatching these movies, there are some shots where I'm like, no amount of dirt is going to make this man look bad. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, and there's like a glow, and it's just, so I don't know. I have a hard time getting on with I understand what you're saying. I follow your argument, but just in terms of my visceral experience watching these movies, it does not align with what I've experienced.
The way you hit visceral there really concerns me, but okay, continue.
But I feel like for me, it's the lovable jerk factor that he really sells well in a way that a lot of other actors probably couldn't. They'd either be actually a jerk or not enough of a jerk. Like, he's hitting the sweet spot of like, and we like it because he's like obsessed with his craft, essentially, right? Like, he's like, I'm gonna like, because the biggest thing when I rewatched Raiders and Temple of Doom, I was like, there's time and time again, he's like high female romantic interest / adventure partner. I'm going to actively choose to not help you because it will benefit my quest for the object or like the next thing I'm trying to do or whatever it is, right? Like Marion, he like ties her back up literally and is like, oh, just stay here, sit tight, it's fine. And then like with Willie Scott, he's like, oh no, you can like he's just throwing her under the bus constantly. And I feel like the fact that I tolerate that and I actually like, it's endearing, I feel like is only something certain like a certain type of actor
Mhm.
could pull off. You know what I mean? And not make him like a unlikable scoundrel.
Mhm. I think the historic sort of period setting of the movie, both like sort of the actual time it's set, but the harkening back to that sort of older style of filmmaking benefits too. Like I don't know if that's something that is everyone sort of consciously feels that way, but there is some idea of sort of like, yeah, I mean, maybe he's being a little mean to these ladies, but it was 1936. What are you going to do? Like that's how things go. So I do think there's again, I don't think they were like, okay, let's set it in the 30s so he can be a little bit meaner to the women. But I think that like now makes it feel less like squishy than it may have otherwise. Plus Harrison Ford, he's super charming. It's like, okay, yeah, he can tie you back up sometimes. Like that's okay.
All right, so I think we're ready to move on to. Do you feel like we've already talked about what's the hallmark of an Indiana Jones film? Like, what are the kind of key ingredients?
I mean, we
Yeah,
did.
I mean, there's this a kind of set of not very interesting. Like, you need a chase scene, you need a MacGuffin, you need that, and I don't think we will insult our listeners by necessarily reciting those kind of simple things. But in terms of filmmaking, we haven't shouted out John Williams, which again, another key ingredient in this. I got in a heated debate in my car the other day because my 7-year-old suggested that the greatest theme song of all time was the Bluey theme song. And I was like, oh, no, no, no. It is the Indiana Jones theme song, bar none, period, end of story. And this went on for like 10 miles.
Baby safe haven. It's not too late.
I think that having a rousing score helps so many of these. Fans on the internet like to rip the John Williams out of films and be like, look, the music matters. And that's a simplistic point, but it really does like change it, right? Like when Indy turns around a fight and you hear the music swell, it's like, oh my God, like this is what I live for. And then I also just want to know, when Crystal Skull was coming out, Spielberg talked a lot about how he had to relearn how to make these movies because it isn't like just a normal movie. Like it's got its own language. And yes, some of Spielberg's tricks are through there. So two ones I would shout out, just way over the top sound design. Like,
Yeah.
I want to hear an Indiana Jones punch. If I show up tomorrow night and I don't hear the like man hitting a ham against a wall sound, like
You're so
I'm
right.
gonna be bummed out. And the whip crack, and that everything is dialed up that high. And I was also really struck this watch through. Obviously, Spielberg plays with light a lot, but the way he plays with light and shadow in these, I think, is separate from his kind of standard filmmaking tricks. The classic one that stands out to me is Indy walking into Marion's bar, right? And you get this visual representation. Marion has lived the last 10 years desperate to escape from the shadow of their relationship and whatever happened between them, which could be really, really bad. And yet here he is, bigger than life there. And that scene goes on. It's a great bar fight just in general, but there's 2 or 3 shadow jokes there, kind of in this play of, Tote has a similar shadow and so on. And I think they replicated that a bit in Crystal Skull, where when they pull rumpled Harrison Ford out of the trunk, and this was in the trailer, he picks the hat and you see this silhouette and you're just like, yeah, I'm back. Like we're back in this. And, results may vary, but we were back in it, and that was a part of it. So I would just say, in terms of filmmaking, those are two that I think have to be kind of present. And I'm interested to see if Mangold, I'm sure the sound won't be a problem, but I'm interested to see if he plays within similar ways because he's a filmmaker with his own sensibilities. And I think there are going to be portions of this movie where he is really imitating Spielberg and portions where he's trying to do his own thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are all really great points. I will only add on to those to say, if for those people who haven't, I do highly recommend, if you're able to see any or all of these movies in a theater, because the sound and the score really hit extra hard in that context, and it is, yeah, everything is really heightened, and it's interesting because there's the John Williams has different approaches for different movies, but it really isn't that different than Star Wars, with the sort of, we've got different themes for different characters. There's a lot of the leitmotifs are happening, and the way he sort of holds back sometimes and like lets especially action scenes play out in silence, and then the music kicks in when the tension or the release is popping up. So there is there is something there, but it's very unique. It's unique to the characters. It's unique to the world, and it works really well. And I'll also just say that, yeah, there's something like remarkable about how you can and people should go and watch Raiders of the Lost Ark like all the time, and when you do, be like, oh, there's so these moments where it's like the silhouette or just sort of like him in shadows, or just the outline of him, and it's just sort of like, yeah, it's Indiana Jones iconography. You can see the whip on his side a bunch of times, but the hat and the jacket, but like that didn't exist. Like they just were creating it at the time, but like you could watch Raiders of the Lost Ark and be forgiven to think that like, this must be like the 6th or 7th movie where they're just like hitting the the things that everybody loves about it. But it's just like, no, like it's there. So it'll be interesting to see, like in what I'm sure we'll discuss in a later segment, like the balance of telling a unique story versus playing off the audience's nostalgia in Dial of Destiny. How much are they just going to be like, remember the hat, like remember the whip, remember the jacket, or do some different things with it, but also like how different do you want it to be, because it's Indiana Jones. Like I don't want the hat to get like burned or anything, like so yeah, I think that these are all elements that are crucial. I also think that like the only thing I'll add is some sort of like diversity is certainly not the right word, but some sort of like villain hierarchy with different types of bad guys that are around, like some sort of tough guy, some big tough guys that get fought, some sort of like mean kind of middle manager, or like soldier, colonel, general type, and then some overarching person who is like much more a kind of like one-on-one, like sort of shadow version of who Indiana Jones could be, which I think is not always exactly there, but is kind of around in all of all the movies that we have so far.
I have a couple of quick add-ons, and then I think we should get to our rankings, because I think that's going to bring out so much more once we get more specific into individual movies. But the John Williams score, I think when I think about it in comparison to other John Williams scores, the indie ones add so much verve, like almost like pep. Like there's an energy to them that I feel like we don't necessarily get. And then the other thing too is that there's big sweeping kind of romantic old Hollywood vibes to the scores, in a way that like makes everything you're watching seem that much more like much grander in a Hollywood sense. You know what I mean? Like, and the other association, not to go back to Disney World again, but like in the, I don't even know if they still have it there anymore, because I haven't actually been to Disney World in forever. But the ride that's like Into the Movies ride, I don't remember what it's.
That's gone. No,
No,
that's gone.
what?
Yeah, the one inside the Chinese theater.
Yeah. That was great. That makes me sad. With the
Yeah.
Wizard of it had a bunch of classic Hollywood movies like Wizard of Oz, and then it ended with like, I want to say Alien, right? Like there's like a part where like
Alien, Singing in the Rain,
Yes.
Raiders. It was a lot of kind of classic Hollywood films. It was a fantastic ride, but yeah, it's been replaced.
But I feel like there's an association with sort of like golden age of Hollywood that the Indian films for me are a part of too. But yeah.
Well, and to your point, if you watch the Oscars and if they start with aren't movies great montage, you almost always see Indiana Jones. Like to this
Yep.
day, like even in the long dormant periods, and it's present in the culture very much the way Star Wars is. But again, I'll show my age. I I watched Muppet Babies all the time, and it was every episode you saw the little clip of Raiders in the opening credits, and you're like, I hope it's the one where they're Indiana Jones this time, and maybe you got lucky and maybe you didn't. Um, and there's a fantastic Simpsons opening where Bart steals a jar of change, and Homer becomes the boulder as he trips down the stairs and almost crushes Bart, and things like that. And so I think, again, I don't know if all of that applies as well to the last 10 years as it does to like the 90s into the early 2000s. But I do think like that kind of ever presence makes it feel like, yep, this is just culture. This is just a part of who we are. And this is what we create in this country. We used to be a country. Yeah.
We used to build things. If we're talking briefly or just glancingly about Indiana Jones parodies, I've got to mention the opening of Weird Al Yankovic's UHF, which is just a straight up parody of the Raiders of the Lost Ark opening, which, amongst other things, ends with the boulder breaking through the wall and just chasing him across the world back to Los Angeles, which is great.
I'd forgotten about that one. Okay, so I think we're ready to rank all of the Indiana Jones, obviously minus Dial of Destiny because we haven't seen it yet. So I think what we'll do is, because this worked out well with our Wes Anderson top 5, I think we'll start at the bottom and then kind of slowly reveal our way up. We'll take turns. So if someone else mentions a movie, although I feel like our lists for this are actually going to be, I'm going to guess, are going to be a little bit more similar. We had a nice variety with our Wes Anderson lists. Which you haven't listened to that, you should go check that out if you like Wes Anderson. But we might have more overlap with this. I'm just going to guess, but we'll see. So PT, why don't you go first?
Okay. So perhaps unsurprisingly, coming in at number 4 is Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. I mean, I have lots of things I want to say about this movie, but I'll try to not get them all in all at once. But full disclosure, I did not rewatch this one yet. That's maybe Friday night is when we'll rewatch it, which is partly to help recalibrate expectations for Saturday for seeing Dial of Destiny. But there's things to like in this movie. I think Harrison Ford's great. And is doing a heck of a job. I think that what I do remember that quote that Greg said mentioned earlier was Spielberg was like, I have to relearn how to direct these, and I don't know if he did. I think that it doesn't quite fully sort of match up. He has a different cinematographer too, or maybe it's the same cinematographer, but he's doing a lot of like 2000 Spielberg sheen on the cinematography that isn't capturing the visuals and that old school cinematography, iconography that Jen has been talking about. And look, here's my central, sort of, I guess, thesis about the problem of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is you can go, I have been trying to, but I guess you can't easily find all of them now. You used to be able to easily find all of them. There were 3 different drafts, 3 different screenplays that went through multiple drafts, that were 3 different stories that were designed to potentially be the 4th Indiana Jones movie, starting in the late 90s. I'm looking right now at the Raider.net, which is an Indiana Jones fan site that may not have been updated since 2010, but that's fine. But it has a breakdown of sort of where stories came from. It includes the first draft of Back to the Future, which is where the refrigerator comes from. The instead of a DeLorean, the time machine in Back to the Future was a refrigerator that needed the power of a nuclear blast, and that got picked up and brought in later by Spielberg, who remembered it from it not being feasible for Back to the Future. But there was in the mid 90s, so pretty soon after, like 5 or 6 years after Last Crusade, there was Indiana Jones and the Saucermen from Mars, which got worked on for a while, worked from 93 to 96. Then they got put aside. Frank Darabont came in, who had done obviously Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile. He had, I think, broken in on Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. So he was brought in with a new sort of story conference from the three people involved, three main creatives, Lucas, Spielberg, and Ford. And they worked from 2000 to 2004 on Indiana Jones and the City of the Gods, or the Phantom City of the Gods. And that didn't pan out. And then in 2005 or sort of mid 2004 to 2005, there was another story called Indiana Jones and the Atomic Ants. And I cannot recall my sourcing
You
on
did
this.
just say ants as in the insects.
Correct, not the atomic
Okay.
aunts, like parents, sisters. Atomic Ants. So and then the Crystal Skull is written by David Koepp, who had written, I think, Jurassic Park. I know he wrote War of the Worlds for Spielberg. And the story I remember reading at the time, or soon after Crystal Skull came out, was that basically they developed these three different movies, and they got to the point where, like, they had fourth, fifth, sixth drafts of each of them, and they got to the point where it was just sort of like, okay, this is essentially ready to shoot. George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Harrison Ford had agreed, I think, just a gentleman's agreement, that they all had a right to veto any Indiana Jones project, and that each time it got to the point of, this is it, the script's written, ready to go, two of them liked it and one of them didn't. And it was a different person each time who didn't like it. And so it was like, I don't know which one's which, but like basically one of them was like, no, this isn't really it. I don't know. It's not working. So after the third one kind of fell through, they gave the three screenplays to David Koepp and said, these are the movies we've been working on. These are the things that we liked about them, and these are the things that were causing the veto that we didn't like. Please make one movie out of this. And if you watch Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, that's it. It looks totally like that's what happened, because it's just sort of like, oh yeah, there's like kind of a movie that's about like communism and the Red Scare. There's kind of a movie that's about Indiana Jones's like World War II, like people, and how there's like a fallout from that. And there's kind of a movie that's about aliens, and like that he finds out that there's actually aliens, and there's ancient aliens that have been around for a while. So like there's each of those, but like none of those are really fully there and not totally fleshed out, and it's just ultimately very unsatisfying, because they're trying to make this generational, we had the last movie was Indy and his dad, now it's Indy and his son, and we're trying to make that happen, but the story doesn't fully come together. Kate Blanchett is innocent, and the aliens did nothing wrong. I think the choice of having it be aliens in the movie is great. I have no problem with that. It's just that the story never actually got finished. It just got to the point where no one wanted to say no anymore.
The aliens were the main sticking point for a lot of people who did not like it at all, right? Wasn't that the major complaint?
Yeah, well, I think people who had not been tracking the fourth Indiana Jones movie on the internet for a dozen years, like I had, were very surprised that there were aliens in the last 20 minutes of the movie, whereas I had known about that since like 1998. Because I had been looking to see like what could a fourth Indiana Jones movie be, and the screenplay leaked, back in the 90s. So, there are people who didn't like that. I think it's fine. I think it totally could have worked. I like, moving from the original trilogy being in the 30s, and therefore being kind of King Solomon's Mines and World War II background, pre-World War II background stuff, into 50s Red Scare sci-fi stories. Tracks, like, that's fine. But I think if the rest of the movie had been stronger, people would have gotten on board with the aliens. But there was enough kind of like already sort of like just sort of sinking around the movie that once the aliens came up, people were just like, nope, I don't like it, I'm out.
Greg, you went to go get a book. So what do you got?
So I grabbed J.W. Rinsler, who recently passed away, did a making of Indiana Jones in the style of the making of the original Star Wars trilogy that he did for Lucasfilm. And I just was tracking. Yeah, they actually, and they're pretty upfront about it. They have a whole chapter called The Atomic Ants from Space that tracks basically everything PT did. So I grabbed it, not to fact check, but just to support you. And I have nothing to correct from that narrative. I mean, everything you said, all the names are correct, and those are mostly in the right order. The one I couldn't find is there's also Indiana Jones and the Monkey King, which was a plot point in one of them, and then that like became the title for a little while, and then they were like, no, maybe not.
That was a Chris Columbus draft for the third movie that was written
Yeah,
after Temple of Doom, but they pulled some of the monkey stuff from that into Crystal Skull.
Yeah. Great dive on history. This is, I mean, again, probably unsurprisingly, this is also my number 4th. And my thesis, you actually almost covered together just a second ago, which is people on the internet dislike this for the wrong reasons, right? You hear about the fridge, you hear about the aliens, as you all were just talking about, and they're like, it's totally unbelievable. And again, with apologies to talking behind my wife's back, she happened to walk through the room when Henry and I were watching it, and she got to the part, the very dramatic shot of the lead-lined fridge label as he shuts the door, and she's like, yeah, because that's gonna work. And I feel like so much of the audience was like her. They just checked out at that moment, right? And it's dumb. Do you know what else is dumb? Jumping out of a plane in a raft, right? Like, these movies are full of things. And again, we've been joking about my son, but like, when you're 8 years old, you don't care, right? And I don't think any of us cared in Temple of Doom. It was like, yeah, that probably wouldn't work. That seems kind of silly, but it's there. Or now I'm just picking on Temple of Doom, but who built mine tracks? Why are you over lava in your mine cart? Like, are you really moving gems through there? Is that what you're doing? I think there is a way in which these movies demand you to just suspend your disbelief and be like, I'm in a fantasy world, right? And maybe I think Shia LaBeouf was having kind of an implosion at that point, and so like my schoolyard friends who were like, Titanic sucks because Leonardo DiCaprio is the worst, and it's like, you just want to be Leonardo DiCaprio. There was a little of that too. It was like blaming Shia LaBeouf for this, and you can't ever blame the failure of a movie on a single performer, right? And certainly the material they're given makes all the difference. But on the rewatch, with another decade between us, God, another 15 years between us and when that movie came out, it really just feels like this is just another Indiana Jones movie in a lot of ways. And I mean that as a compliment. Like, yeah, it's different. And yeah, there's CG gophers, but like, they always play with things and do. I mean, my son has less of a problem with the CG gophers than he did with Donovan's face melting, that he was like, that's dumb. And I'm like, yeah, it does look kind of dumb today, right? There it is.
Oh.
So that being said, I do think the primary problem I have with Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is a lot of what PT alluded to, which is just the story doesn't cohere in a useful way. And to me, the symbol of that is Mac, Indy's best friend. That could be a really cool character. Like, oh, you were spies together during World War II? That sounds awesome. Let's learn more about that. And that character never makes a moment of sense. And he's always switching sides, and he's, it just doesn't work. And it's a contrivance of plot and stringing together kind of action sequences they were imagining. So that's enough ragging on it. There's still a lot of fun in it. And, my thesis in 2009 was like, the first 20 minutes rock. And I stand by that, but there's a lot of good later in the movie. The ant sequence, maybe some dodgy CG, but it's a really fun sequence of, Kate Blanchett squishing a bug between her knees where the goop sprays the camera. It's like, what else do you want, right? What else do you want in one of these? And I will give it a lot of credit. I think, with apologies, sometimes Karen Allen, I think, had been out of the game too long and struggled a little bit. But the idea of bringing Marion back and making it that Marion and Indy were together, not one of her finest acting moments, but when he says there were a lot of others, and she's like, well, what was the matter with them? And he says, none of them were you. And she melts. And like, I melt every time. It's like, you're damn right. Like, Elsa's no Marion. And, Willie isn't either, but that would have been before Marion, blah, 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 or between Marion. Anyway. So the idea that Marion is the one he ended up with, I'm really curious to see what they do with that. But, it seems it's really great. And the idea of the son is great. I think in some of those treatments PT mentioned, it was a daughter. And maybe we're getting a course correction because I think a daughter is much more interesting to pair up. But Shia
It's just
LaBeouf
woke
is
Disney back in
yeah.
2002 blowing up Indiana Jones.
My favorite is the fan bros who are like, "Oh, Kathleen Kennedy's involved in the new Indy. I'm out." It's like, check those credits, bud. Go all the way back to Raiders of the Lost Ark, and you will find her name. So yeah, I am excited to see what they do with it, and not to get into spoiler territory whatsoever. I haven't read spoilers, but I've heard a lot of kind of fans say they didn't ignore it. Whereas, people felt Force Awakens pretended the prequels didn't exist. And I think that's a fair argument. But it's like, no, this is the fifth movie. And I think when Kingdom of the Crystal Skull loses that pressure of being the last time we ever will see Indy, I think it's going to feel better while still being a little flawed. But a solid number 4, but a gift that we got it, and we wouldn't be where we are tonight without that fourth one. So I'm glad it's in the mix.
No, for sure, for sure. This was also my number 4. Though I feel like, and we're going to get to this in a second probably, it was closer than I thought it would be for the number, like my number 3 and my number 4. I'm just like, ooh, like I don't really know now. But I agree with what PT said a while back with where on paper the premise of this should work, where the idea of like, oh, we're moving from one pulp era of pulp to another, right? We're going from the World War II to the atomic age, and that the aliens come with that. Like that shift to me, in theory, makes a lot of sense. But when I was rewatching it this time around, there's something about, and it's especially interesting having watched the Fabelmans as well. But like the representation of the 50s in this movie is so weird because and I think that's part to me, or at least this time around, that's part of what was like off about it, because first of all, the Shia LaBeouf character Mutt, right, is like, it's like Steven Spielberg watched The Outsiders too many times. Like he's like this, the every stereotype extreme of like the greaser kind of tough guy from that era, right, and down to the switchblade or whatever. And he's combing his hair and stuff like. So I feel like that was like, I think he kind of had no chance because of the way his character was designed in that way. That he was always going to be kind of ridiculous and not. I have hard for me to take seriously. But then even just that opening scene where you have like the crazy teenagers going for a joyride and then the soldiers, and I was like, oh, Spielberg had a lot to say here about like the era that he grew up in, was born in. I don't, the timeline is hazy, but like if you go watch the Fabelmans, it's like, oh, like clearly there's something deep in him about his childhood in this era that he kind of like wanted to represent. But at the same time, I'm like, oh, this is why he wanted to make musicals, because this is basically Grease. Like, so there's a lot of that, but I totally agree that like certain lines in this made me cackle, like where Mutt's like, and you're a teacher, and he's like, part-time.
Great line.
Still gets
great
me.
Trailer line too.
Yeah. And there's, and like how he's kind of trying to give like, he's, without knowing it's his son, trying to give fatherly advice. Like, are you sure that's what you want to do with your life? Like all that stuff I thought was good. But yeah, I think I like PT's rundown of the structural issues. I think that's probably why this doesn't hold up even now. Like it's a fun watch and a good adventure, but like as a film, like doesn't stand up to some of the other ones we're going to talk about.
And I do want to be clear. I haven't read them for over 10 years, but I did read the other screenplays that were available online. None of them really worked. Like I get why they didn't film them, but I mean, the Saucerman from Mars, the third act is he's flying. Indiana Jones is flying a flying saucer, and like
Oh.
in a space battle with aliens. It's like if the people didn't like Crystal Skull, they would have lost their minds. But the like the so yeah, again, I get why they didn't do it, but there's just like all these little like threads that feel a little undercooked or underexplored. Get get like pulled a little bit more, and it's just sort of like, oh, it's like it's so close, like it feels like it maybe like it's weird because it was like all the sort of scheduling with Ford and Spielberg, but like if they'd only had even just like another year, could they have like worked on the writing and figured out a way to make it work? But yeah, I don't know, it didn't fully work.
And I was just gonna co-sign everything Jen said about Spielberg and the Fablemans, and then just also George Lucas and American Graffiti, right? I think this is Spielberg doing some American Graffiti as a tribute to George. Shia LaBeouf had a lot of stories about like when learning to be a greaser, he just talked to George Lucas, and old daddy Lucas would just like be like, this is how we did it. And I remember a particular one where Shia LaBeouf was like, he was trying to figure out his comb prop and what he's supposed to do with the the comb. And he showed it to Lucas, and he's like, this is like a greaser's comb, right? And George Lucas pulled out like the oldest, dingiest, bent old comb from his pocket and is like, this is a greaser's comb. And still, think of his resplendent mane. I mean, George Lucas still has the kind of greaser quality to it. And so I do think that's like, Mutt is who Spielberg wanted to be when he was 16. And like all of us, that's like who we tell people we were in high school is who we actually wanted to be when we were 16. And so this is kind of a little bit of wish fulfillment in that way as well, as a part of that. And I think you're right to say it doesn't quite work. Not the only Indiana Jones film that is way different after The Fablemans, but I'll save my comments for later.
Yeah, you might not have to wait too long. But that's true. I will also say, I certainly will not use the phrase Shia LaBeouf is innocent. But Shia LaBeouf is not like bad, and the degree to which Shia LaBeouf is annoying feels intentional, and that like his character just, again, like many other things in the movie, wasn't fully baked. And because there feels like there's some like, it's clear that his sort of I'm Marlon Brando in The Wild One like persona is an act that the character is putting on, and there's something more real underneath, but like that like is sort of displayed but not really. And it's because again, because there's like 10 other threads the movie's following on, and it was like, if we just had more time with him, and I know very few people are like, well, why wasn't there more Shia in Crystal Skull? But I think that I think it would have been more successful if they had been focused.
My last Crystal Skull thought before I think we move on is, in thinking ahead to Dial of Destiny, it's so interesting, and I'm really curious to see how this is going to play. Those two films are going to play next to each other, because I feel like they've done the I'm old, this is my last ride. They already did it. You know what I mean? Like Crystal Skull is framed as, he's like, what are you, 80? And I'm like, well, Harrison Ford is 80 now in the Dial of Destiny. You know what I mean? Like it was a joke about how old he was. Now he really is that old. And yet we're still kind of going through the same motion of like, he's still got it. So I think that's just really interesting that we're just doing it again, but he's so much older.
But so I was struck watching Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. I can't believe I paused to say the whole name. That Harrison seems to be playing older, because if you watch him on Shrinking, he is not like, he's playing an old guy that he didn't become. And I don't know if that's him trying to figure out who Indiana Jones is as an old guy, but he seems way older in Crystal Skull than he does in Shrinking and some of the Star Wars sequels. It's like, oh, like, I don't quite know how he missed there, if it is performance, or maybe he just, didn't care, right? And maybe he thought some of this was a paycheck. all credit to him. I bet it was a really nice one. Bought a couple planes or paid off a couple golfers you hit with a plane. And so, I think he couldn't quite find it. And shrinking is the thing in the last year that has made me think, I think we might be in for a good time or a better time for this new one. Close the Crystal Skull discussion with some terrible speculation. On my other podcast, my host makes me speculate because he knows whether I'm right or wrong and will make fun of me later for it. So our listeners will probably know the answer to this. Did Mutt die in Vietnam? Or the Korean War? Maybe the Korean War is a better question. Is Mutt still around? Is Mutt alive in Dial of Destiny?
I think it would. I think Crystal Skull's after the Korean War, so I think it would have to be Vietnam.
Maybe early Vietnam or something. Is he around? Or a car accident? Or he was in the canals racing at the end of Greece, and
he died on his way back to his home planet. That's a good question. Yeah, will there be a Shia LaBeouf photo next to Sean Connery and Denholm Elliott on Indiana Jones's desk? And he's just like, really racking him up. And then they just move on.
I don't know.
So does anyone know what the specific year that Dial of Destiny takes place in? Because the trailer implies that it's the early 70s, right?
Yeah. I mean, the music being Sympathy for the Devil means should be at least 68, because I think that song came out in 68. But I think it is the early 70s.
I think the parade is John Glenn's return, so that would be like 66. But don't trust either my historical knowledge or my interpretation of those events quite correctly.
Look, we're puzzling something out like Indy would.
Yeah.
Where's the inscription? We need.
So that is pretty. I mean, Vietnam is in its throes by then, so it could be.
So I wouldn't
it's a little early for the real casualties of Vietnam,
right? But maybe he's not in the way they rationalize he's not in the movie is that he's shipped off to Vietnam, but we don't know if he's alive.
Although he'd also be like late 20s, early 30s.
Hey, right? Man. Your card gets pulled, you got to go. That was the way. If it's John Glenn returned in 1962, so I feel like that's too early.
We were way off. Yeah.
But it could be if it's Neil Armstrong, if it's that return, if it's from you're coming back from the moon landing, then that could be 69. Which would be
Wait, so Craig, you said that listeners might know the answer. Like, is there an answer? And you're just not telling us?
I don't know the answer. I'm sure all the critics have seen it, so I'm sure some reviews say
I see what you're saying.
Where it is. But also, I'm anticipating that people are perhaps listening to this after they see Dial of Destiny.
They've seen it. Oh,
they've used the Dial of Destiny, and they're in the future.
So, all right. I think it's PT's number 2. Number 3.
Number 3.
Unlike Jen, this was not a difficult choice. This was not a close gap between 4 and 3, but it is similarly not a close gap between 3 and 2. It is Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which is the second Indiana Jones movie, which to refer back to that screening where I saw all 3 of them in a theater a couple of years ago. Once you make the turn into the last act, this movie plays like gangbusters. Like it's just the fight in the with the kids, the minecart, the waterfall, the rope bridge. It's just like hit after hit after hit of amazing action sequences, almost all of which are like the B-sides from the Raiders of the Lost Ark story session, where they were just like, we had all this stuff we didn't do. Like, what if we built a movie around this? And there's a bunch of other stuff that is really interesting about it. I like that it made the sort of move away from we're going for a Judeo-Christian artifact and we're going to go with something from another culture. There are some problems with it though. What I will say is 2 things, because I'm sure we'll dig into it more. One, I left, we had a little break after each movie, and I finished Temple of Doom, and I was just thinking, man, that last act played like gangbusters. And again, to bring her into the discussion in absentia, but Jasmine was like, that movie's bad. Like, that's not a good movie, and for all the reasons that we will discuss the problems of the movie. But I'll also say that there is, if similar to our Star Wars discussion, I continue to exist lurk in the forums of places that talk about toys, which is a lot more sort of retrograde, middle-aged men, mostly white men, talking about these things. And they're like, well, I can't believe everyone's now decided that Temple of Doom is problematic or racist. Like, this never was a problem. There is a review in the Christian Science Monitor from 1984 that is like, holy crap, this movie is super racist and sexist. This is insane. I can't believe Steven Spielberg did this. So, maybe that was a lone voice in the wilderness, but the problems are not a retroactive cancel culture problem. Like, there are core central problems. They borrow too much from the like 1930s exoticism of foreign lands, and cross a few lines that, if you grew up with it, you can squint or you can close your eyes and look away, but like it's pretty bad. This is pretty bad stuff. So but not not so bad that it's worse than Crystal Skull. So here we go. That's my number 3.
This is my number 3 too. Is this your number 3, Greg?
Yeah, it's also my number 3.
Okay, we can just openly talk about it now.
Yeah.
Greg, go ahead.
I mean, I remember distinctly after my first couple years at grad school watching this for the first time and being like, oh, so this is Orientalism. I get it now. Like, I do think there's really no excuse for the exoticization of these cultures and the abstraction from it. And then you couple that with not only your kind of stock white savior figure who saves them all, but like, hey, the heroic forces are here. Who is it? It's the British colonials. Oh, that's what we're doing. Thank goodness they're here to just mow down the natives and save the day. It's pretty inexcusable. And I completely agree that there's a lot of really good stuff here, which doesn't undercut the really bad stuff. And, I think it is, a place of white privilege to be like, but it still can be pretty fun anyway, because it's not my face that's getting mowed down by the colonials. So I always want to caveat that, like, any compliments I give it, if your response is like, no way, it's trash, it should be thrown away, I can't really, argue for the baby in the bathwater. There's a lot of bathwater here, not a lot of baby. Stop, Greg. The metaphor's bad. So
why are we bringing babies into it, please?
But so all that, primarily that. But I did read a really interesting read on the banquet scene. So the banquet scene, if you read it as this is what Hollywood thinks, India is like, that's really, really bad, right? Eyeball soup, snake surprise, they just eat bugs, terrible stuff. But I recently read this interpretation of it that was a defense, but was saying, like, remember, in that moment, it's a whole bunch of thuggy cultists who discovered that they're about to be found out and have a British official there, the regional governor, and so maybe this is all just crazy performative. Like, let's be the stereotype they hold of us, and they will flee, they will run away, right? Like, and so Willie kind of plays into what they're expecting. I don't know. That's doing a lot of work that's not on the page, but it gave me pause to be like, there is a way in which the end of the film isn't always in play when people argue about the first part of the film. So it's worth considering in my mind.
The dinner scene, I think, is, I don't know, it feels like the clearest example of like when you watch it again, where you're just sort of like, yeah, this is like bad on a yeah, like socio-cultural level. But I did see, I saw it, not that defense, that's an interesting defense, but that like it was someone discussing it, and it was just sort of like I want to say it was someone who actually worked on the movie, but like in some sort of crew tech capacity, being like, the joke wasn't supposed to be, look at all the weird things these people eat, like isn't this really gross, but the joke was supposed to be on Willie for like, you know, like her exaggerated overreactions to it. So like it's supposed to be sexist and not racist, is sort of the defense, I guess. But like it was interesting where like the sort of ultimate thing was just sort of like, yeah, it didn't work. Like the joke didn't land. It wouldn't really set up properly. I will say that you know, not to Britta Perry this, that like, you know, I'll excuse the racism and I'll excuse the sexism. But where I draw the line is, why is there a moment when they bring out a snake and cut it open and a bunch of little snakes fall out and someone starts eating them and Indiana Jones doesn't react to it? Like, what the hell are we doing? Like, what is happening in this movie that they just forget to tie that back in, and have him like see it and respond to it, even if it's to like contain himself? That's the biggest crime. Not really, it's the racism, but it's that's always frustrated me.
Maybe because the snake's dead.
But the wriggling snakes that are come out
I know,
are
but
alive.
they're little. I don't know. Yeah,
I think it's supposed to be he's so busy talking to the
yeah.
I don't know, I forget, not the prime minister, but the sort of the local official, and then the Maharaj, who's at the end of the table, that he just maybe doesn't see it, but missed opportunity.
I think even if the sort of bend over backwards to rationalize this theory that Greg's offering, even if that was actually the intent, I feel like it's undermined by the gaze created by the camera, right? Because even if like the characters are like being performative and they aren't really like that, they aren't really eating those things or whatever, the camera is like really like almost filming it like it's a horror scene, right? Like where it's like there's disgust built into the way it's shot, right? And so I think even if the plot is saying it's something about these characters, the audience is still supposed to be grossed out, and I think that's still the lingering problem, even if this other theory holds true. And that's what really stuck out on this rewatch, was that I was just like, wow, like this is really, so much of this is just the camera being like, look at this foreign weird custom, isn't it gross? And there's just so many bugs in this movie. It's just she has to reach her hand in. They're just crawling all over her back.
We are going to die.
He said, how many times does he say that in that scene? It's like it's ridiculous. But so a lot of critics trace the character of Indiana Jones back to Alan Quartermain, which is the H. Rider Haggard Victorian adventure, like imperial adventure series. Alan Quartermain, you might also know, like shows up in the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, I believe. He's like one of the more minor characters. But the King Solomon's Mines is the first book in that series, and Temple of Doom to me is the closest to that that book, where it's like there's no layer of displacement of like, oh, this is inspired by these old adventure stories. It's just reproducing that type of adventure story. Because like all of King Solomon's Mines is like, look at these crazy monstrous supernatural Africans. Don't we want to like be heroic and like steal their stuff and rescue, like, you know, and then escape them by a thin margin and have a good time, right? And so to me, Temple of Doom is the one indie film that kind of sticks out as like just doing that again, as opposed to like being inspired by that and trying to like iterate on it or like, you know, update it or something like that. But yeah, the other thing too is just like, I do not like Willie Scott. That was actually like a really big.
You mean Mrs. Fableman?
Oh, is that really? Oh, I'm just processing that.
Oh, and it just clicked. Well, we'll talk about Raiders in a bit, but the mom had a monkey too. Man,
Mhm.
Oh,
she's
whoa.
full of them, and of course, I think most listeners will know. Of course, this is where Spielberg met Kate Capshaw, and
Yeah.
they've been married since. So,
Mhm.
it was fun to see them walking the red carpet last Oscar season, and you're like, hey, there's Willie Scott. Um, yeah, the scene for me where just the Indian short round are playing cards and it's gold in their part of the scene, and then
Mhm.
she's stamping around and grabbing animals and screaming, and it's like it's so over the top. It's hard to imagine what they were actually looking for. And I think there's no way to interpret that as this is a foolish woman, right? And when she drops the gun and says, I broke a nail. And part of it is that all those jokes have become cliche because they were here, but they weren't ever that acceptable. And I I have heard a lot of stories that Karen Allen really pushed to make changes for Marion to make her Indy's equal, and there was clearly no attempt to do that here. This is like, we need to swerve away from Marion as we do the second film, and so we're going to make it somebody totally different. And they did. I mean, I think the two characters are opposites in almost every way, but it's pretty bad.
It
Yeah.
that scene in particular in the camp on the campground really reminded me of the original Parent Trap movie. Do
Mm,
either of you know what
yeah.
I'm talking about? Where
Yeah.
where
Yeah. You're right.
the like stepmom to be that we're not supposed to like, they sort of like trick her into like having a total freak out and being like, I hate the woods. Right.
Yep.
And I feel like that's an exact line that Willie says at some point where she's like, I hate outside. So I feel like that, I don't know, like that's probably what they were going for, just that she's just a city gal and she's the
Yeah.
humor is that Indy is so at home roughing it and she's not, or something like that. But even like the scenes between the two of them, like I this time around, when they finally kind of get together at the end, I'm just like, this doesn't make sense.
Mm.
They have no chemistry. Like, where's Marion? Like,
It's too James Bondy. It was like, he'll get
yeah.
together with every girl every time. And it's like, nah, it doesn't really work here.
I feel
The
like
mirror like flirtation, and then that works. But then when she's like, I'm right here, when he's touching the wall, you're like, what is, like, she's like that hard up. She's like, yes, in the middle of this awful adventure, I'm desperate to be with this man. It's like, I don't think that really is anybody's real life. That is just a male
yeah.
fantasy
And
projected
she
on her.
keeps saying like, you're just in denial, you're crazy about me. I'm like, nothing he's done has really indicated that.
Mhm.
Like,
I think the sort of maybe overarching statement to bring all these things in together is, these are elevated, I don't want to say high fantasy, but elevated fantastical movies. But in general, the main characters or the main hero characters are believable people. And she's the exception, where it's just like, this is not a believable person. Like, this is some sort of a cartoon that has been imported into this. And I remember, I mean, in the 80s or maybe even after that, like there was always sort of said jokingly where it's just sort of like, well, that's the divorce movie, because both Spielberg and Lucas had gone through divorces and they were, really feeling it, which kind of translates to like, they just didn't like women. They were mad at broads. And so they made Willie Scott, and, she's a broad you're not going to like. And, that's, it's tough. It's not, doesn't really hold up, which I don't really think it's Kate Capshaw's fault. I think it's just,
No.
that's what she was asked to do. And then separate from, now this, I feel like what I'm going to say sounds bad, but just on a sound mixing audio level, she is also like incredibly high pitched and shrill, like all the time, to the degree where it's like, it's fun when the sounds are heightened for punches and gunshots. When it's her like screaming or whining, it's just like, Jesus, this needs to stop. Like, this is grating and annoying. And again, maybe intentional, but not a good intention by the filmmakers.
I just
can we gush
wanted
about Short Round now?
Oh, that's exactly what I was going to do. I was just going to say that, we have to acknowledge, we're in the year of Ke Huy Quan. And I will say, I think there was a part of me that probably in the early 2000s thought they had coaxed him to put on a kind of accent that was like a performance of his
Right.
race. And now having spent a year seeing him give heartwarming speeches and talking in interviews and following his Instagram where he just loves taking selfies with celebrities, which is totally endearing. I think it's really him, and I really love that character. I don't think this movie has a better moment for me than when they wake up, they hug, they give each other their hats, and then they kick ass together. And there's a mirroring there that's beautiful, and it's actually a much better father son thing than they ever achieved with Mutt and Indy. So yes, no notes for Short Round. No Time for Love, Dr. Jones will always be iconic. So
Hang on, lady. We're going to go for a ride. It's, I mean, yeah, in retrospect, like if there's one thing to change, and there's probably many things we'd want to change, but maybe if there's one thing to change about Crystal Skull, what if it was Short Round instead of Mutt Williams? Like, what if, and obviously that's hindsight makes that a lot easier. But yeah, he's great. And I mean, as someone who grew up on Temple of Doom and also the Goonies, it was just sort of like, I love him. Like, this guy's great. And him coming back and having this, we've discussed it, but him having this phenomenal run and re-entering pop culture has been awesome. I have no speculation. I have not read anything. I don't want to know. I just hope that, like, even if it was like last minute reshoots, they did something to put him into Dial of Destiny.
Aw, that would be great.
And I'm going to just say the Short Round television show is the only Indiana Jones spinoff I'm ready to accept at this point.
Yes.
Do it. Whatever era, his current age, but who did he become after being with Indy? How did Indy abandon him? Presumably,
Right.
I'm there for that.
How'd they
story.
part ways with
Yeah.
not presumptuous. Yeah, and I think this time around rewatching it, I was like, in every way that I'm not buying the Indy Willie relationship, I am like, the real romance is Indy Short Round. You know what I mean? For me, I'm just like, it's because when we're in the final sequence where they've made him drink the whatever, and he's like possessed. Willie screaming at him doesn't snap him out of it, but Short Round being like, "I love you, Indy."
Well, and burning him.
And burning him. Yeah, sure. But it's a combo move.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel and like, so to me their relationship was so much deeper with not as much said, right? Like, I feel like it was so much more believable when he's explaining, oh, like, I caught him. Like, their backstory is so believable in the context of Indiana Jones. You know what I mean? Like, the fact that, like, they're very similar, and they're making things up as they go along. They're just trying to scrape to get by, and then their paths cross, and then they team up. Like, it just makes so much sense, and they're adorable.
They are. I agree. I also want to shout out. Was it before we were recording that we were joking about the Anything Goes performance and the potential racism of that? I don't know. But I mean, a great preview for Spielberg's West Side Story, 35 years or so in the making. B, whatever about the musical number, that opening sequence in the club. I'm sorry to take this from Greg, but I will note it's Club Obi-Wan. That's great. Like, that just works super well. And the whole sort of sequence ends with, I think, the prize winner for weirdest cameo in Indiana Jones movie, with the presence of Dan Aykroyd for like 2 lines.
Just a phenomenal section. Harrison Ford in the white tuxedo jacket can get it. As always, he's no longer attainable. Well, so no longer attainable in the white tuxedo jacket, and then the ripped shirt, bulging muscles on the bridge. You're like, is this a prequel? Because I think you bulked up a little. Um, uh, I just want to give a shout out. My college roommate, his name is Zach. I don't think he'll listen to this, but his favorite Indiana Jones character is the waiter friend, and like if I beat him at the battle mode of Mario Kart, he would always just turn to me and say like, "I go first, Indy. I go first." And I can't watch that scene without thinking of him and how, it's Star Wars has a lot of those too. It's like, yes, it's like 2 lines, and you're like, that's a book, that's a comic. Like, there's so much there that you could explore. Maybe nobody's clamoring for it, but it's like you're like, yeah, they've been on adventures together, right? And it's perfect. So I love that opening scene. Yeah, all of it.
We've also seen that type of scene in so many other things, including Star Wars, right? Like it's the classic, I'm going to buy something from you, double cross. Like I feel like we just saw this in the Bad Batch, right? There's an episode of the Bad Batch that's essentially this.
And not to go back to keep bagging on Crystal Skull, but like it's funny that they spend however much time they spend with Mac in Crystal Skull, and it's just sort of like, oh, but and really. I feel bad because I don't remember the character's name, but yeah, the waiter partner in Temple of Doom has like 4 or 5 lines, and it's just sort of like, I believe everything about the two of you. And maybe it's because they're not trying to full double cross upon double cross upon double cross between the two of them, but yeah, it's very elegant storytelling. And I think that's true across the whole movie, except for the parts that are very inelegant.
All right. We're ready to move to number 2?
Yeah, I think it's time to disagree on something, finally.
Yeah. Is this the one?
I believe. Because I feel like I'm going, I think chalk of a pretty standard. I'm saying Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade for number 2, which, it's tough between 2 and 1. I believe I don't want to Bogart. I don't think that's the right word, but I don't want to take something that I think a fellow co-host will say. But I've heard Greg on podcasts say that like, well, I'd rather watch The Last Crusade as like my Indiana Jones movie, and I, for the longest time, generally felt that way too. Like I used to say, Raiders of the Lost Ark is the best Indiana Jones movie. Last Crusade's my favorite. It's no disrespect to Last Crusade that like over the last like 5 or 10 years, I've been like, actually, I think I'm back on Raiders being both. But like not by a ton. Like Last Crusade is awesome. It's super fun. It's we can get into all the things that are great about it. It's interesting to me that there is a segment of people who are a little older than me. You guys are a few years younger than me. The people who I know who are on the other side that are about 3 to 6 or 7 years older than me actively dislike this movie, and are just sort of like, clearly Temple of Doom is the second best. Last Crusade sucked. When it came out, I was so disappointed. And we can unpack why, but like there is a lot more humor. Things get a little goofier. It's possible that Marcus Brody is done dirty because he used to be a perfectly respectable academic and university administrator, and it becomes a bumbling buffoon. But it's awesome. It's the funniest things come in and around Marcus Brody in this movie. Yeah, I mean, it's possible. Again, the critique. It's possible that it's too much of an overcorrection from Temple of Doom in that it's just sort of like, what did you like about Raiders? We have Nazis. Like we have a Judeo-Christian artifact he's going for, huh? Like, isn't that right? But the addition of the tone, the little prequel section in the beginning, parentheses, River Phoenix is the only person to successfully play Indiana Jones besides Harrison Ford and keep people interested, even if it's only for like 12 minutes. And just the introduction of Sean Connery as his dad, which it's very unfortunate that we didn't get more from more movies when he was active as an actor to get like the chemistry between the two of them. But it is also perfect that like this story is the story, and I would love it for Dial of Destiny to be so good that I'm just like, this, yes, like I want this to always be included. But unless it's like so absolutely fabulous, I have no way of even like partly ever questioning it. I'm always sort of in my mind going to be like, this is a 3-movie story that ends with them literally riding off into the sunset. And it's perfect because of that.
So
So
this
I
is where the podcast falls apart.
Yeah.
Let's go.
So I think I'm definitely the other way for these last two. I would put Raiders here and Last Crusade at the top. Jen is the same as
Yes,
me, matches
correct.
me. But I think we can just say that, but then let's just have our Last Crusade discussion and then Raiders and then have a Zoom fist fight perhaps after that. I would always take Last Crusade over the top for the reason PT said, and now I'm like, where did I say that already? Somewhere. I'm too present online. The AI is going to have a Greg bot very soon. So I think Last Crusade, if I'm being critical of it, because we've often started with like what's going wrong with these movies, I do think the way in which it becomes a family, not family as in it's about a father son, but family as in like this is good for the whole family to sit down and watch. It's kind of sanitized in a way. Yes, there's still a little violence. Yes, there's still a little sex, but it's like this is just kind of, it's more goofy at times and would, again, my 7-year-old thought this one was great. He checked out a Raiders and Temple of Doom and thought this one was great. And I think that's kind of what they were going for. They went too dark. They needed to kind of do a carbon copy of Raiders in a lot of ways. So they went back to all this. And that's there. I also, even all our criticism of Willie Scott aside or included, I find her more compelling than Elsa. I don't really get Elsa in this film in a lot of ways and who she is and some of that. But then that's all the negative stuff I'm going to say.
That's funny because I don't even compare her because she ends up being a villain. So in my brain, I categorize her as a villain and not a romantic interest, really.
That's interesting. But yeah, I think this movie's so fun. You allude to Marcus Brody. The greatest film cut of all time is from, with any luck, he's got the Grail already.
Disappear, blend in with any luck.
Yeah.
That was almost my opening line. I don't know if you also considered it.
And then cutting to him, there's my favorite Denham Elliott joke. Just after the cut, he says, "Water, no thank you. Fish make love in it," which is just so incredibly strange as a line that a human being would say. But it gives me endless joy to watch this movie. I quote it all the time. I suddenly remembered my Charlemagne.
Mm-hmm.
I even just used the other day, I was somewhere with my son who wouldn't get the reference, but I said, "What about the boat? We're not taking the boat." And, it's a really, totally fun time to me. It is very much Star Wars and Empire to me. It depends on the day and the mood I'm in. You might find me and I'd say Empire is there. But if I'm saying, what belongs in the time capsule, what belongs in the top 10 Harrison Ford movies, you have to pick Raiders of these films as the best, most important, most culturally impactful film. But I still think I prefer personally Last Crusade. I'll stop rambling. Last Crusade rules.
Okay. Here's why Last Crusade is better than Raiders. One, the puzzles are way better. Like all the trials that he has to go through, the Jehovah, like all of those things, like they're just so good. They're in terms of like as the viewer following along and being like, oh, like and feeling smart as I'm figuring things out with Indy. Like I think those to me are just so much more enjoyable than any of the ones we get in the other movies. So that's one. Two, Sean Connery and Harrison Ford, pure magic. Can't be beat. I just like, I don't know what to tell you. The scene where they're both tied to the chairs and flipping around is just,
this is intolerable.
And just the physical comedy of like, oh, he's as Sean Connery's trying to talk, like it's flipping around again, like it's just. Mm-hmm. And the comedic timing between the two of them, and they're just so believable as father and son that don't get along and yet are so much alike, and like It's and like that Sean Connery is like, one minute you're writing him off as a doddering old man, and the next minute you're like, oh, like I see the resemblance. Like he's
Mhm.
got it too, right? And I just, yeah, it's like I am hard pressed to think of another movie that has a duo like that has just so much chemistry and humor and are just pure joy. So those are my two reasons why I prefer, or I'm always going to pick Last Crusade over Raiders, even though Raiders, for all the reasons that Greg just said, like is probably the one, right? Like it's the one that people are going to point to 100 years from now to be like,
Mhm.
yes, this is the Indiana Jones movie. But um, and then he was named after the dog at the end. It's an amazing bit. Like it's and and it's amazing because I should get more specific. It's amazing because it's not just because it's a joke, but it unlocks so much about Indiana Jones as a character. The idea that he had to craft this name for himself to sort of puff himself up and make him like, I am an explorer, I am an adventurer, right? It's like his brand, right? But then we find out that it's just this really hokey origin. Like he came up with the name because that was what his dog was named, and it just makes him so much that much more endearing, right? And really unlocks like the performative, arrogant sort of like overconfidence that we see in all the other movies, and like gives it another layer underneath. So
Mhm.
that's my case.
It also has the meta truth of George Lucas's dog was named Indiana, and sat in the front seat with him, and so it was the impetus, the inspiration for both Chewbacca and the name Indiana Jones. Previously, Indiana Smith, I believe, was the original draft. Look, I have no problem with everything you're all saying. I love Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Like I said, if we had done this podcast, probably I now that I'm thinking about it, I think it was when they did like an anniversary screening in IMAX of Raiders, which must have been 2011. So because it wasn't too recently, so it was either 2011 or 2016 because it would have been on the 1 or the 0 or the 5. And I saw it in IMAX and I was just like, I think I love this movie more than Last Crusade. And again, that's not easy because I've always loved Last Crusade, and before that, I would have been right there with you guys, because everything you're saying is correct. It's super fun. My spin-off story, I do want the short round story. I don't want a TV show, but I would love to know more about the Brotherhood of the Cruciform Cross and like what they've been up to and how they've stopped the Grail over the years.
That's a Dan
The
Brown movie.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
true. It would be a Dan Brown movie. Um, that's fair. I mean, everything about the Sean Connery, Julian Glover as Walter Donovan is great. Um, I also, it may be age difference, but I remember the like release of the movie and like it being this huge thing. I remember it being on TV. It was also, I think, on the VHS, like that was either in a box set or maybe we just had like we purchased the VHS of Last Crusade. There was like a Pepsi ad that had
Yes.
the knight, like you chose poorly and all that, with like a stuntman who's always in shadow, supposed to be Indiana Jones. And I mean I love that ad. And like Greg said, this movie is eminently quotable. I'm going to not a roommate but a floor mate and a long-term friend of mine, Mark Ranshaw from when I went to college. We both took this like huge, like in a huge auditorium, this seminar from a renowned scholar about World War II. That was like the rise and fall of Nazi Germany, and it was the whole class was like just him giving lectures, and he was a really good storyteller. So it was spellbinding, and then it was like you had one midterm and you had a final, blue book, sit there. Both of them 50% of your grade, so it was a big deal. And Mark spent the whole, like leading up to the final, saying he just wants to write in his blue book, Nazis, I hate these guys, in a quote, and then attribute it to Dr. Henry J. Jones Jr. And turn it in and see if he would get an A. I don't think he did that, but he did. He said for the whole semester that's what he was going to do on the final. I will also just note there are amazing scenes in Raiders early on in the school, but I don't know if any movie fully captures the insanity of tenured faculty like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, between Brody, Henry Jones Sr., and we stand an action hero who will not grade papers in Henry Jones Jr. And who just like walks out on office hours. Nothing but mad respect for him on that. He's praxis. That's all I'm going to say.
I
Amazing.
want to say this is the one that I definitely think hits a lot different post Fablemans. A father and son who both sleep with the same woman. Ayo, isn't that kind of what the problem in Fablemans? Anyway, so that, and then the train, of course, right? Like, you know, the train is such a central part of his awakening at the start of Fablemans, and then that is also the impetus of waking up. Young Indy is telling. Other thing I want to just throw in, these are my last Crusade scraps. I guess it is well known. I only learned this week from a different podcast that Fedora, which is the only name given for the man at the beginning who finds the Cross of Coronado, was originally Abner Ravenwood, and if you want, could still be Abner Ravenwood. He goes unnamed. It's credited as just Fedora, but that was like, oh, that makes so much more sense to me that, you know, this could be, you know, the dad rejects him and makes him count in Greek. So I'm going with Abner, and we're going to track down, and I'm going to model my life off of Abner. And then all that fits in well. That sounds fantastic to me, but you know, again, they clearly didn't want to say that in the film. So up to your viewer's choice.
That is interesting. I will note that in terms of my scraps on it, that the quote "it belongs in a museum," which is in when you cut to Harrison Ford being Indiana Jones and as sort of a thesis. That's an interesting. We talked about the sort of Orientalism, overt racism. There is that sort of low key colonialism problem, potentially inherent in Indiana Jones, of like, the British Museum of it all, of just sort of like, what if I go to this crazy place and I obtain your obtainer of lost antiquities? What if I go and do that? And it's like, nowadays that does not necessarily thought of as being so perfect. And I have for a little while now, when I teach the upper division. We don't have a rhetorical situation segment today because we're not doing one movie, but when so this is my faculty thing I'll bring in when I teach the upper division, sort of more forward thinking, professional minded students, the sort of professional audience essay in the arts and humanities thing. I sort of give them, like, you have to choose an ethical dilemma, and one of the readings I give them and the framing of the prompt is about, like, what do we do with looted art? What do we do with sort of art that is in museums that, maybe should go back to the home countries, and the sort of debate back and forth about that. And I have a quote of, this is perhaps best summarized in the words of famed archaeologist Dr. Henry Jones Jr. It belongs in a museum. Literally no student has ever commented on that meaning anything to them, or reacted to it when we've if we're reading it out loud in class. Maybe no one cares. Maybe no one under the age of 30 cares. But yeah, that's just one of the many things. Like, I use that GIF all the time. If someone says or does something that is like, oh, this is perfect, this is brilliant, like, it belongs in a museum.
Is the cross the only thing Indy ever gets to keep? I think across the movies, everything else he either doesn't find or gives away or has taken from him. I think that's the only thing we actually see make it to the museum. But Jen, to you.
No, I was just going to say that this is something I often ponder, because I love Indiana Jones as a character, and I love the franchise. And yet I'm like, well, how do we, and I put this question later in our Google Doc, so we can just skip ahead to it now if it makes sense. But what's the right way to bring that character and these types of stories into the 21st century? And I kind of had to backpedal because I was like, well, Crystal Skull was in 2008, but like maybe I just mean 2023. But like, what is the proper way to update this character so that's no longer, because I think the original movies work because there are also Nazis. So it's like they have there's a bigger, it's easier to ignore the post-colonial, like the imperial plundering if we're also fighting Nazis.
Well, yeah, it's not being taken from the people of these countries. It's being taken from the Nazis who are going to take it anyway. So it's like, well, we'll just take it first. And then isn't that better? Like, you don't want the Nazis to have this. And you can be like, oh, yeah, that's true. I don't. And so it makes it easier. I mean, with, oh my God, I can't remember his name. Hannibal, Jyn Erso's dad.
Mikkelsen.
Yeah, Mads Mikkelsen.
Mikkelsen.
I think are we just bringing a Nazi back? He seems like a Nazi to me. So it's sort of just like, which unfortunately also makes sense in 2023. It's just like, maybe the Nazis are back. Like, let's just do that and we'll keep it easy.
Yeah, and I'm interested to see where Indy is. Again, I have read very little, but it certainly looks from the trailer like he's not like a well-respected, renowned professor now. He seems like, a figure who's probably familiar to the three of us, which is the guy who should have retired and is still taking up his full-time tenure line. And so I don't know if that will also, the late 60s is kind of the leading edge of when you could start to have some of that movement really gathering, at least as I understand it, the kind of you're a criminal. But I also, Helena has the line in the trailer, and I stole it, you stole it from me, and I stole it from you, and I stole it from you, and that's called capitalism. Like, there is a way in which they're playing with the greed as a part of that. Mm-hmm. And there's, this will bleed into the next discussion. There's always been like a Belloc indie thing, the dichotomy of, are you getting it for the betterment of humanity, or are you doing it to make yourself wealthy? And this is a stretch, but Willie and Indy are kind of like that, right? Willie just wants the diamond. Willie just will marry the Maharaja to be rich and wear fancy dresses. Like, and he, the theme of fortune and glory runs there. And so, maybe, Indy has always been the white hat in that. And yet maybe he's going to find himself at the point where, now even that's not good enough, and maybe it should never have been good enough. Who knows? I really don't know where it will go.
I'm sidetracking briefly, or jumping back perhaps. Am I the only one who has had the sort of thought, I feel like this is out there, it's not just my thought, that Temple of Doom being a prequel to the to Raiders of the Lost Ark and the other movies allows them to do the sort of fortune and glory thing, and that it's the events of Temple and Doom that push Indy away from just being like, I just need to like get stuff and like, get the money and the fame for it, and instead is like, does it in a slightly higher purpose way, which again maybe is colonialism and imperialism and all of that. But could at least be seen as high-minded, certainly in the 30s and to some degree in the 80s when the movie was being made.
That said, if someone finds these movies in a time capsule hundreds of years from now, is there anything that in the films themselves that is going to tell them, oh, but this happened before the other one?
Yeah, there's a date in the beginning.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
It says, Shanghai 1935, and I think Raiders is 1936. South America 1936. But you got to pay attention.
Right. Yeah, you're giving me a lot of credit there. Being like, well, it's just there. I didn't do that math. When I first watched these movies, I was just like, okay, that's a time long ago.
I do feel like that was a thing when you were, if you did notice it when you were a kid, where you were just like, oh my God, like you could set a movie before another movie. That's insane. Yeah. So look, your number two, my number one, both of your number twos is Raiders of the Lost Ark. Good movie. Ever heard of it? And it's again, it's tough because Last Crusade is maybe in many ways more fun, but I just think Raiders hits on every level. It is still funny, while not being as centered on the comedy as Last Crusade, but it's just sequence to sequence, moment to moment, just feels. I'm sure there's flaws. We could pick away at some flaws, but feels like you don't question it. It feels impeccable as it's unfolding, and the we were sort of mentioning it earlier. It feels like we're in like we're celebrating the iconography and power of a longstanding character, but it actually was the movie that introduced him, and I feel like that speaks to the success of it, the sort of images that stand out, and that come through consistently across the whole thing, are incredible. Karen Allen in this movie is just miles ahead of any other female companion. Belloc in this movie, in my opinion, is miles ahead of any adversary. Sala is at the peak. I mean, he's great in Last Crusade too, but Sala is just great as a sort of sidekick here. The opening, again, not pre-credits, but beginning James Bond type mini adventure, is it just works so well. R.I.P. Alfred Molina's character. You were an idiot, and
I thought Alfred Molina had died. That really scared me. I was like,
sorry,
wait.
sorry. What I was going to say was R.I.P. and the actual name, and then I was like, I don't remember what his name is. It begins with a T.
Satipo.
Yeah, Satipo. It's not because of the T. It has a T in the middle. R.I.P. Satipo. Alfred Molina, as far as I know, still going strong. I apologize if I cursed him for tonight. But yeah, it's excellent, and I will say that in my opinion, and again, I haven't really thought this through. I'm just saying it, so maybe I'll be wrong. But like when I think of what are the greatest, most successful scenes of exposition, of extended exposition, in movies, it's the finalists are Doc Brown in the mall parking lot explaining the time machine and how he developed it, and everything that's happening with the car, in Back to the Future, and the scene with the two military men showing up to talk to Indy and Brody, and like, we have the telegram. What is an arc? Like, who's Abner Ravenwood? And it's all just an info dump, and it is so fascinating. And it's basically just like, oh right, well, Indiana Jones gives a good lecture, and he's just giving like a lecture on the history of these things. But it's like the sort of ebb and flow of Indy and Brody's excitement about like, oh my god, they could be on the verge of finding this thing. Like, this is amazing. And like, look at all this thing, this crazy. And like, they buy into the sort of myth, and then they start throwing it away, or just sort of like, I don't know, like, well, that's what they say. Who knows? And then the military guys have their own little internal back and forth about like, William Hookins is clearly like, all these people are Nazis and I don't trust them. And the other guy is just like, oh, I'm so happy we found the right people. And there's all these little character moments. And that moment carries through to the top men in the penultimate scene of the movie. It's just great. And I love it. And as fun as Last Crusade is, the sort of joy I get from all of the pieces clicking together of the adventure of Raiders puts it up into number one for me. Even though, again, like I maybe have more fun with Last Crusade, I think I get more joy from Raiders.
Jen, you share your thoughts.
I can't argue with that necessarily, though. I stand by my shouting into my mic and blowing it out to argue why Last Crusade is better.
This is why. Yeah,
but no, you're totally right. Like, none of the other movies happen without this one. And that's a cliched thing to say about a multi-film franchise or I that somehow turned into this other thing. As you were saying, it's a perfect trilogy that we decided to mess with. But I feel like this does such a good job of starting the franchise, starting the trilogy, for all the reasons you just said. And it really, like, Belloc in particular, like, because I don't know, I didn't really think too much about Belloc, honestly, as a as a villain, but in this rewatch, I really clung to his speech about like, you and I are really the same.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm you, just like 2 clicks darker, kind of,
It
like,
wouldn't take much to push you to
yeah,
become me.
yeah. And I think that's such a good character moment for both of them. And that there's like a mutual respect. It makes
Mm-hmm.
him so much more interesting as a villain, I think. And then actually that like Marion does kind of like him also
Mm.
is like very interesting and complicated. Because you're not quite sure. You're like, oh, like, because she says like, I have no loyalty to Jones. He's
Mm-hmm.
brought me nothing but trouble. And in that moment, you genuinely don't, or at least I don't. I genuinely am not sure if she
Yeah.
means it or if it's an act. And I think that's really great. Like it makes me want to watch it more.
I feel bad because I know Greg's been up a really long time and it's late, but 2 things. The opening shot in Marion's bar in Nepal, which is this crane shot that goes through this drinking game that is this oneer that I think is like 2 minutes long. But like, it's not flashy, but like has 100 people in it and has this like, it goes from this the sort of full scene to like what's happening with like just these intricate little like movements around the shot glasses to like people reacting around someone's face. It's so intricate and so masterfully done and performed by Karen Allen and all the other actors. It's excellent. And I'll also say the Indiana Jones movies have never had like a secondary villain as great as Tote, the German guy who burns his hand. We not thirsty. Like he's so great and he's so creepy. And it's really satisfying to see his face melt at the end of the movie because he's such a jerk. So these are more points in favor of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
All right. So we did, PT put a bunch of Oscar trivia in here. Do we want to save that potentially for
Sure.
when we actually review Dial of Destiny,
That makes sense.
or just like a future episode? And I think the whole point of this episode was to get hyped for Dial of Destiny, and so look at using this retrospective as a way to kind of look ahead and get excited and think about what's going to happen in this movie that we're about to see. So how are we feeling now after we've had this huge conversation, which again, we've hit 2 hours. I don't know how we keep doing that. But like, how are you feeling? What's your headspace right now for Dial of Destiny?
I'm still, doing my best to tamper down my enthusiasm. I think definitely the last month and my rewatch and just kind of Indy being more present in the culture has just all brought back like my love of this character and that he means so much to me. I had a lot of hope. I mean, this podcast has gone through how the can reviews really hurt it, but as kind of more of the voices I trust regularly have seen this movie, and particularly kind of normies, not film critics, I am getting higher and higher hopes. I'm going to go try to make it through the day tomorrow by being a good dad while really just having my mind totally on getting to the theater and seeing Indiana Jones. So, my bar, which I think I've voiced on this before, is as long as it's a higher note than Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, I think this is a success and worth making. I think this is a chance it's a gift to get to say goodbye to Harrison Ford and to let him do this one more time. Seeing him on the press tour, it's been him saying like, yeah, this is the one I get asked about and this is what matters to fans. I just saw a report from the London premiere, I think was the most recent one. And there was like 100 fans outside that Lucasfilm or Disney had, given passes to and gathered. He signed one thing for every single one of them. He's like, everybody gets one, and just he went down the line. And if it was their pass, their program, their fedora, and it's like, that's not the Harrison I know. And so it's clear to me that his love for this film is different than it is for Star Wars and so many of his others that are classic. So my hype is in a good place. I think, pretty easy to please. And so I'm hoping that they just knock it out of the park. And I've sampled a little bit of reviews, read a couple things I didn't want to read so far. There's a little bit out there, and it's like, I think they're taking some chances, and I would rather a movie that takes some chances than pure fan service. So I'm here for it, even if they're not all home runs.
We move away from Wes Anderson and suddenly this becomes a pro-normie podcast. We've just been waiting for the normies to tell us that it's good.
I really regret ever saying that word on this podcast. What have I done? Started the whole thing.
The norm take review. I'm in a same general place as Greg. I haven't been reading as much. Once the sort of initial can reviews started trickling out and they were negative, I was like, I'm shutting it down. I'm seeing it, so whatever. So I'm glad I haven't even seen it, but I'm glad to hear that there have been some more positive reactions out there. Even I feel like there was a little window of time, especially when it was like Harrison was talking about it, but it hadn't premiered yet, where it was just like, what if this is like great, like not even good, but great. And I'm dialed pretty back from that just because of that initial response. And so I'm back to like where Greg is. I just want this to be better than Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. So it is like, we have that, like, boom, slot that in. That's good. And it's everything you were saying. I love Harrison Ford, love Indiana Jones, love Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones. So it's great that we get to see it one more time. There was absolutely no guarantee this would happen. So that's really, really nice. Phoebe Waller-Bridge is incredible. I'm excited to spend time with her in a big movie. And the fact that it's this movie is very cool. Even though I forgot his name a little while ago, Mads Mikkelsen is amazing. I also love seeing him in any movie. So it's like, all of this is good. All of these are pieces that are really good. I really like the idea of the time period, even if we are not is fully able to nail it down, because we don't want to look it up because that might be spoilers. But the sort of late 60s, early 70s idea, like that's really interesting to carry it forward and how it may go. My trepidations are, there's on one level, it's just like, feels weird to have an Indiana Jones movie without like substantial contributions from Lucas and Spielberg. I know they're both producing, but it's weird. Like James Mangold's really interesting. I've liked a number of his movies. I trust him. I trust that the people are not just, they're saying things beyond what it feels like they would just say to sell it. That the positive things they're saying, they've given him a Star Wars movie. Lucasfilm's given him a Star Wars movie sort of on the back of this. That's another strong endorsement. It's still weird that it's not Spielberg and Lucas. The three of them really sort of felt like the alchemy that made the character. Will that carry forward? I hope it does. In terms of that they're taking chances, I like that. I did sort of like initially in the post-can kind of negativity settle into like, I just hope it's The Force Awakens in terms of how I feel about the nostalgia factor of it, as opposed to like Ghostbusters Afterlife. And I don't know, in like later thinking about that, I don't know if the difference between The Force Awakens and Ghostbusters Afterlife is marked difference in those, like the quality of the two movies versus how much I care about the franchises, and like the difference of being in 2015 versus being in the 2020s, where I don't know, I feel like the geopolitical context of the last like 6 or 7 years have made like glowy, dewy nostalgia not super fun to think about. So I'm interested. I hope it doesn't like veer too much into all of that. I would just love a good to even decent fun Indiana Jones adventure.
I think that's similar to where I'm at, where it's actually probably good that we've had such an up and down with the reactions, because I think it's helped me not get too excited or put too much expectations. And that way I'm more likely, I think, to just have a good time and not be overly critical coming out of the theater. And so I think that as long as we get a solid adventure with like Indy doing Indy things, all the things we've been talking about for over 2 hours now, of like him, applying his knowledge of myth and folklore to solve puzzles, and then good action scenes that have a lot of humor and that are coherent and dynamic, and we can see what what's happening at all times. Like all those things that we've kind of been talking about throughout this. I think the quips, like him being kind of a lovable jerk, like all the things that we've sort of been talking about. I feel like as long as there's enough of that in there, even if like maybe the Spielberg magic is not there, or because I feel like that's the most common thing I've heard from critics is like, this is good, but there's something missing. Like it doesn't have that spark that's of the Spielberg. So even if that's true, but we still get a bunch of fun indie adventure stuff, I'll be happy, I think. Any other things that we're hoping to see, or like it could be even an obscure random thing, and then we'll close out, I think. But like, what's something that would just make you so happy as a fan?
Short Round.
That's a good one. And you'd be happy with just like a quick cameo of Ki-hye Kwan.
I would honestly assume that it was filmed like in the post Everything Everywhere All at Once like awards run, and it would just be like, I mean, I don't want to, hopefully not like this, but I assume it would sort of be like the Joker scene in the Snyder Cut, where it's just very clearly like just filmed in a green screen and like weirdly inserted in the middle of the movie. Or like it'll be like at the end where it's just like, and we're at, finally Dr. Jones is retiring from his position and his 1/3 filled classes. And there's just like at Tony Stark's funeral, just like CGI'd into the side is just Short Round being like, yes, good, thank you.
I want a really good last shot because PT alluded to it. Last Crusade has such a good last shot that it felt like a fitting end, and that's okay. And we've gotten this more, so give us something on that level, something that says like, I'm satisfied. Like he's away now. I don't want that to be his tombstone a la some other movies. I won't spoil a random other movie of late. But I want to know that this character is good, like is landing in a good place. So that's a cool final shot.
Yeah, I hope there's a bit with the hat that doesn't feel hokey. That's what I would want. Like, because I feel like I can envision the hokey version. Where they're like, and one of you alluded this earlier to be like, look, remember, there's a hat, there's a whip, like these are all things that you like, right? But I feel like if it's more kind of in keeping with the original films that we've been talking about all this time, and kind of has that that visual humor through the action, I think that would be really great. All right, I think that's a wrap. Greg, I don't know how you're still awake.
It's like 5 a.m. where he is.
It's so late, and you have to go see this movie tomorrow. Like, how are you going to do this?
I'll be fine. I rally. So okay. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. But I do think I might have accidentally woken up my toddler. So I'm going to say, find me on ioncanon.com.
All right.
Bye, Greg. Happy indie. Oh no.
All right. Where can people find you, PT?
They could find me on Instagram or Letterboxd at PT McNiff, PTMCNIFF. And I don't think I've woken anybody up. So I'm safe.
That's good. And you can find me at Sopchakchai, SOPCHOCKCHAI on Instagram, and Qui-Gon Jen on Letterboxd. I also do not think I've woken anyone up, but I feel like I'm so sequestered in my closet secret passage office and the door shut that like total havoc could be happening outside the door and I wouldn't even know. So that will be a surprise after we log off. All right, but yeah, for everyone going to see Dial of Destiny this weekend, hope you have a great time. We'll see you on the other side.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening. You can follow The Long Take on Substack at thelongtake.substack.com. Subscribe for free to receive reviews of films with Oscar buzz, as well as new films and series from pop franchises like Star Wars and Marvel.